Welcome, attendees, to another Monday Musings. It's a series of interviews and discussions sponsored by the Liskus Center for Scholarly Enrichment at Denison University. My name is Fred Porchadou. For those of you, maybe two or three of you that I haven't met before. And I teach in the English department, and I'm joined this evening by my good colleague, Karen Graves, from the Department of Education.
Yay, Karen.
Yay.
She's coming to us currently from, what is it, the Boston Public Library?
Beautiful city.
Excellent.
Oh, there. Yeah.
Quite appropriate topography there for our subject this evening. And we are all here to celebrate and to hear from our good friend and colleague, Dr. Sandy Runzo, especially about her recent book, Theatricals of Day, Emily Dickinson and 19th Century American Popular Culture, published by the University of Massachusetts Press. The way that we thought that we would do things this evening that's the way, is for Karen and I to ask a couple of prepared questions to get the ball rolling, but we want to encourage you all, especially since many of you know Sandy so very well. If there is a question that you that occurs to you over the course of the first half hour this evening, write it into the chat box and we'll just ask it to her directly, or you can ask it directly, but go ahead and put your name in the chat box or your whole question, and that's how we'll make the list. I think that's probably the best approach. Let's dive in, shall we? Dr. Runzo, explain yourself and use both sides of the paper if necessary. You divide your book into 5 central chapters. They are on exhibitions, on popular music, on minstrelsy, captivity stories, and photography, or identifying people and using the image of the author after the author's lifetime and so on. The author as exhibit herself. Which of these chapters was the most challenging to write? Which one was the most difficult to figure out as part of the puzzle of Emily Dickinson?
That's a great question, Fred. I guess first I just want to, again, thank you all for being here. It's really thrilling to see so many friends, student friends and colleagues and old-time friends. It's really wonderful. And thank you, of course, to Adam Davis and the Liskus Center. I really appreciate the invitation to be here. Challenges. Well, you may not. May not be the answer that you really want me to head the road to head down, and I could end up speaking for the whole hour on just this, because I would actually say that every chapter was challenging, and every chapter had its unexpected challenges. I think largely because there was so much to learn. Every time another area became something I wanted to explore. I mean, once it became clear that there was a lot to study and to research with popular culture and Dickinson. Each door that opened was to either an open field or just a huge library. One of the first chapters, I guess the chapter that made me start to think about this as a book project, involved the music. Yeah. And some of you have heard this story more than once, but really I was not really planning to write a book about Emily Dickinson. And really, I was just very casually looking through a book about Dickinson, and I was just kind of looking through the appendix. And it was a book about music, Dickinson and music, but the book was focused on, it was kind of a catalog of information, but it was largely a book about musical adaptations of Dickinson's poems. Other composers of which there are like hundreds who have done this, who have set some of Dickinson's poems to music. And I was just kind of looking through it, just looking through it. And as a fluke, I was looking at this appendix in which this author, Carlton Lowenberg, this is a book from the 1990s, listed by title and composer and publisher, the music, every piece of sheet music that was in Emily Dickinson's personal collection of sheet music. Now, first of all, I did not know that Dickinson had a personal collection of sheet music.
That's how basic we're starting. Is that
so, it? Yeah, although I knew a lot about Dickinson, and I knew that she played the piano, and I knew that there were references to songs that I didn't know what these songs were in some of the letters. But I had no idea she had a collection of sheet music. And looking through the collection, the titles of the songs, there were lots I didn't know, but some were surprisingly familiar. Songs like, Home Sweet Home, or Bonnie Doon, or The Girl I Left Behind Me, or Old Dan Tucker, or other songs that seemed like they were minstrel songs. There were a lot. There were a lot of songs. Dandy Jim, it was very surprising to see this, partly because it was clearly, I didn't know what a lot of these songs were. Mostly I had no idea what they were, but they were clearly not religious songs. It was very obviously popular music to me. So I'll compress my story a little bit. I got in touch with the Houghton Library. At that point, it's only been about 4 years that the sheet music collection is available online from the Houghton. And they were very nice, and they made copies for me of every piece of sheet music. I asked for about 5 or 6 pieces, and I literally got a letter back that said, the librarian literally said, there's good news and there's bad news, and the good news is you can have those 6 pieces of music you're asking about. Possibly the bad news is you have to take the entire collection of sheet music. And of course, this turned out to be a very fortunate thing, because it's been fascinating to work with it. Now I have all the sheet music. What does it mean? Who are these composers? What does this music mean in the 19th century? After kind of going through it and studying it, and it was very enjoyable to do this. It was a lot of fun to do this, but I started to notice there were a number of pieces by this group called the Hutchinson family, and who are they? I had no idea who they were. So I guess in response to your question, Fred, there was so much information that I knew nothing about it was both wonderful to work with it, but challenging. And those of you who've looked at that book, it might be clear to you that I really have only looked at a fraction of the music in that collection. Although I've looked at quite a bit and wrote about quite a bit, it's really just a bit of the music. There's so much more to work with. So there was that challenge. You might imagine, if you're going to talk about blackface minstrelsy, that's a complicated thing.
Yeah.
To try to write about that and to study it and to ponder what it means in the 19th century. For us, blackface minstrelsy is a very charged sort of topic and history, very charged, and people respond to it with very strong reactions. Just someone doing that kind of work, it might seem disgusting, or it might seem offensive. I mean, it would for us in in 2021, in the 21st century, or sometime beyond the 19th century, it would seem difficult to work with that. And how do you talk about that and think about, how does one think about it? But I was trying to figure out what this meant in the 19th century. It became very clear to me that blackface minstrelsy, the fact that Dickinson had numerous pieces of blackface minstrel music in her sheet music collection is evidence that it was a very pervasive form of entertainment. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's one thing I really came to learn, is that minstrel shows, minstrel music was very pervasive in the century, was very popular, was maybe the most popular form of entertainment in the 19th century. and blackface performers were everywhere. And it was not something, it didn't seem to be something that was repellent to people. It was part of holiday pageants, Christmas Day parades. There were blackface performers at circuses, very commonly at circuses. So, they were just very, very much everywhere. There were toys that were very popular, toys. I guess one thing, the challenge of working with this is both the complexity of it, but it also has become apparent to me that there are widely diverging understandings and theories about what blackface minstrel music and performance, what that means. There, if in the world of all the historians and scholars and musicologists, maybe the one point of agreement is that this is a kind of performance. But beyond that, is it racist caricature? Is it genuine, earnest efforts to try to recreate Black experience? Is it social satire? I mean, different people, different historians and scholars, as I said, have very different views about what the meaning of it is. So, again, it's that's a complexity of it, but also, very, very extremely interesting. I'm not sure. I guess something I tried to grapple with Dickinson. What does it mean? Doing this work made it clear to me she has minstrel figures in some of her poems. And even just, again, if you know something about Dickinson's poems, you realize there's a lot of music in the poems, and there are a lot of musical instruments. And once I started to notice or do more this in-depth study of minstrelsy, it became very evident to me that some of these instruments, these were the instruments of the minstrel show. There are tambourines and banjos and, and castanets and, and violins and lots of drums. Those were, and other instruments. And, those instruments have other, other settings, but it became, I guess what I started to notice was that these were some of the, that figure in that poem playing a tambourine. It suddenly dawned on me like, oh, that's a kind of minstrel figure. So I mean, am I talking too much? I may be talking too much about this this first topic. I guess the other chapter I just wanted to mention, because this has also been very interesting, was the chapter on early photography. And in some ways, the challenge of that is there's so much about just early photography, but Dickinson connected with early photography that is so mysterious. In the first daguerreotypes in this country were produced in about 1839, and there was, people were in awe. People were just awestruck. It seemed like a miracle, or this was magic. How is this possible that an image of a person or of a setting or of something can be recreated on this with daguerreotypes on this metal plate? It just seemed like magic. And all these theories about early photography, they all seem to center around this issue about what is it you're seeing in a Daguerrean image? What is this? And there are all these theories about it actually is a person that you're seeing. It's a living person. And with daguerreotypes, if you move them around with different lights and different angles, the image can seem to move.
Yeah.
And you kind of can fade in and out. But this question about what did the daguerreotype reveal was a huge issue. Does it reveal somebody's character? Does it reveal something about their inner life? And there are many people who thought that it should reveal that is what was revealed. Yeah. It was there was something more than just a surface image that was being conveyed in a daguerreotype. And all this kind of mystery and these questions around what this early photography was, this also got played out with Dickinson, very, very much so. One of the curious things I learned was that nobody in Dickinson's family likes that daguerreotype of her. We have one image, one authenticated image of Emily Dickinson. And if you feel like you know what Emily Dickinson looks like, you've seen that image.
Yeah.
It's the only one that has been definitely established as Emily Dickinson. But what's curious is that nobody in the family liked it. They didn't think it looked like her. And there were, and I mean, another thing I learned was in doing this research, maybe some of you knew this, but I never knew this, despite all the time I had spent studying Dickinson. That daguerreotype, the only one that we have, the only image we have of Dickinson, it was missing. That it went missing for decades. It was missing for decades. And as with many things,
do we know who was who was it? Just misshelved? Was it absconded? Was it
well, you perhaps won't be surprised to know there are different stories about what happened to it, and this has not been established definitely. But what ultimately happened is that believe it or not, in 1945, a cousin who was living in Michigan wrote to, who was it? I think it was to Mabel Loomis Todd's daughter, Millicent Todd Bingham, who was working on editions. Mabel Loomis Todd was one of the first editors with Thomas Higginson of the poems and worked on editions of poems and letters. And her daughter, Millicent Todd Bingham, got I believe this is right, I'm pretty certain it was her, got a letter from a cousin of the Dickinsons saying that he had the daguerreotype. And he says that in 1892, I think it was 1891, 1892, when the first editions of Dickinson's poems were being assembled a few years after Dickinson died, Lavinia, Emily Dickinson's sister, gave it to him. He was, I think at that point, 22 years old, gave it to him, and he took it. But so somehow it ended up with him. There are other stories that seems very definite the way I said that. And apparently it did arrive from Saginaw, Michigan, in 1945, the original daguerreotype. But there are other stories that people insist on that daguerreotype went missing almost immediately. And partly because they didn't like it.
Yeah.
When these early editions of Dickinson's poems and letters in the 1890s were being assembled, the publisher understandably wanted a picture of Emily Dickinson, but the brother and Austin and Lavinia, the brother and sister, they would not allow that picture to be used. And there were all these, I won't go into all these details, but there were all these just, I have to say, kind of ludicrous ideas that they came up with, how they could create an image of Dickinson that they thought looked more like her. I guess I'm tying this back to these theories about early photography and daguerreotypy, because it's connected to this question about what do you see when you see a photograph of somebody, or what do you expect to see? And whatever Lavinia, the brother and sister, Lavinia and Austin, expected to see, apparently they didn't see it in that daguerreotype. And they did not want that to be used. So much so that the first time there was a photograph, I think it was in the early 1890s letters, that an image of Dickinson was used. They ended up using this portrait of Emily Dickinson as a child that was lifted out of a painting of the three Dickinson siblings. Hey, I just saw Jen Luber's kids. Hey, that they used a painted image of a child of Emily Dickinson at the age of 10, or the age of possibly 8, there's some dispute about what age the child is. That was the image they used of Emily Dickinson in the first time there was an image of her used in one of her, it was letters the first time it got used. And you might, again, you might not be surprised to know, they didn't think that painting of child Emily looked like her either. And of course, it just seems crazy you want a picture of the poet, and they're using this picture of this, whatever, this 8-year-old that they said didn't even look like her anyways, but that was what they settled on. This is how much they did not like that daguerreotype. So anyways, I've talked, I don't even know how long I talked about that. Question number one. 25 minutes. So anyways, so, in short, there were challenges and, really interesting challenges though. I have to say, I worked on this, as some of you know, for many years, but I really loved working on it.
It shows.
Yeah, it sure does. And Sandy, let me just say, this is such a beautifully crafted book. The trajectory of how you lay out those 5 areas of focus and the crafting at every level of, it's just such an inviting book to someone like me. I don't study poetry. I don't, but it's just a wonderful, wonderful book. So thank you for the book. And my question has to do with you as the scholar, what it is like to try to write something new about an iconic figure like Emily Dickinson, and how you navigate your way in what must be hundreds and hundreds of scholars for a very long time writing about her. So I don't know if there's more about that you would like to talk about.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful to study, in this case, a writer, an artist, a poet that clearly so many other people also love, and that many people are just, many people find something in Dickinson's work that is fascinating or bewildering or inspiring. So I like that. I find that very satisfying. And I guess it occurs to me that I think it must be the same kind of feeling that anybody would have who works with studies or feels some kind of close connection to any artist or any thinker or a public figure or just or a musician or whatever. It's if you feel you have that kind of connection and really feel drawn to that person and study that person's work and really feel you understand something about it, even if there's still lots of mysteries about it. One thing I have learned in working with Dickinson is that people who write about Dickinson and study Dickinson have very strong opinions about Emily Dickinson, and many people do not want those opinions messed with or fooled with. So again, that's kind of wonderful that people feel so fervently about Dickinson, and it makes for interesting, interesting conversation about her. It also amazes me how there seems to be just continuous energy around Dickinson. I feel like just a couple of days ago, I saw something in the newspaper about Emily Dickinson. I can't remember what it is now. But you may know things like in the last 4 or 5 years, there have been 2 movies made about Emily Dickinson. There's that TV show that's called Dickinson that's in a second season now. And I have not seen this show. I can't really quite figure out how to see it, but it's getting rave reviews. You can see it on Apple TV. I keep hoping it'll show up on Netflix. I know how to watch something on Netflix. I don't understand how to watch something on Apple TV, but it's gotten, this show has been written up in the New York Times and in the Guardian. This is a show about Emily Dickinson. And it's a very, it's an image, the show apparently is highly anachronistic. but it shows in Emily Dickinson's, a side of her which, for whatever reason, has often kind of been ignored or suppressed. So, some people who knew her family members and people who knew her have written about and said things like that they thought that the mischievous side of Dickinson, or the Dickinson who had the droll wit, or Dickinson the rascal, that side gets lost, or people don't, that somehow the solemn Dickinson is the one that gets more airtime. And I like the mischievous, wild Dickinson. That I think there's lots of evidence that she certainly had a wild imagination, but that she, is what's the word I want, that there's a ferocity there, and a fun, there's a person who is fun and mischievous there as well, and apparently that's what this TV show definitely picks up on, among other things. So I guess I just also find that curious that there doesn't seem to be any, really even any slowing down of interest in Dickinson. And that's true on a scholarly side as well, but in just kind of in our world of popular culture, it's intriguing to me that there are these
Sorry.
Is that me? Am I doing that? What if that there are these movies and this TV show, and there have been many novels at this point written that kind of try to fill in stories about Dickinson as well. And that, those are very interesting as well. So
Fun.
I think that's all I had to say about
Well, we're coming up on the time when I'd like to welcome questions from the floor, but not quite yet. I do have one more, and it actually follows on what you were just talking about. Because as I was reading your book, I did notice that you push back politely, but firmly against some of the previous Dickinson scholarship. It doesn't tend to, it does. It portrays her as quite an alien figure, somebody who's completely detached from the society that's going on around her. And it strikes me that it's such a revolution to abandon that and to show that she is, even though she's not going to cultural events, that doesn't mean that a person is ignorant of the popular culture of their day. And so you put her back in community. But the thing that puzzles me is, how did we get to this kind of crabbed, freakish view of Emily Dickinson to begin with? I mean, was it an act of sexism? Was it an act of scholarly? I mean, how does that accumulate, or how did it accumulate with Dickinson?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I guess I want to say first, many people still hold that view about Dickinson. Many people still see her as a reclusive, isolated, detached figure, and like that image of her. And I have to say, I can understand why people would hold that view of her as well. She's so unconventional. It seems to me that there's a lot of effort. What's the word I want? It seems that there's an impulse to try to see her as conventional, but there's really nothing conventional about her. And what you do with someone who doesn't really fit what you would expect a person to be, or a woman to be, or to act, how you would expect someone to act. And she did, she never married, and she did not seem inclined to marry. She had many very intense connections and relationships, some of them with women. She lived her whole life in her parents' house. She's also living during the Civil War, in the 19th century. So these things these things are also understandable, but you know, there are things about her that how does one understand, like why the things that we do know about her, how does one understand that? It's easy to sort of interpret those things that, oh, she was isolated. She lived her whole life in her father's house. She was reclusive. But I think there are probably some other reasons that version of Dickinson has taken hold. And really, as I say, there are many people who still hold this view of her, but it really, in my understanding, it really wasn't until like the 1980s or the 1980s that scholars started to even concede that Emily Dickinson knew about the Civil War and wrote about the Civil War. And actually, there are a lot of poems that are about the Civil War. I think that some other things that contributed to the isolated, reclusive, strange, excessively neurotic version of Dickinson is that when the poems, people knew she wrote poems, but when like the hundreds and hundreds of poems were discovered after she died, the hundreds and hundreds of poems that no one had ever seen before, although people knew she wrote poems and had seen many hundreds of them, because she would include the poems and letters to friends. People knew she wrote poems, but nobody knew she wrote that many. And there were, again, I don't even know how many, literally, 1,000 poems that no one had ever seen before, or maybe more than that, loads. So this was, kind of a source of awe and wonder. And once again, it's like, what do you do with someone who's, it just seems so unusual isn't quite the right word, but it's so unusual. And like, so she must be so unusual. And, how do we describe someone who's so unusual? And then when you look at the poems themselves are strange. This is the reason, the strangeness of the poems also is the reason why early editors of Dickinson's poems rewrote her poems. And it wasn't until 1955, with Thomas Johnson's edition, this was the first time that we got Dickinson's poems in a form that she wrote them. But they rewrote them because it was, the rhymes aren't quite right, or what's with all the dashes, and it's just, she kind of messed up here. They were powerful. I guess people thought they were powerful, but they were just they didn't seem right, or there was a force to them. But let's just fix up the rhymes, or let's just, let's rearrange things a little bit. So the early editors, through many editions of poems, rewrote those poems and changed the punctuation. And the poems, another thing that's kind of strange about the poems is they're very abstract. And it's not surprising that one would not necessarily make connections with the world, because the poems, when you're writing about truth or beauty, or there's a poem I really like that I guess in the mid 80s, it got identified in a really important book that connected Dickinson to the Civil War. And I think maybe that was the first time that was identified. This poem, as I'm going to recite a couple lines to it, was identified as a poem about the Civil War. But it's so abstract, it doesn't seem to have anything to do with the war at all. But the first, I think I'll get these right. The first few lines are, I think this is describing soldiers on a battlefield, but again, it doesn't say that directly. Here are the lines. They drop like flakes. They drop like stars, like petals from a rose. When suddenly across the June, a wind with fingers goes. But, again, they dropped like flakes. They drop like stars, like petals from a rose. That is not obviously about soldiers. It just seems to be about, not just, but it's kind of lovely, and it's gentle images and natural images, but you wouldn't necessarily think an image of dropping, who's the they? No, yeah. This is the classic Dickinson thing. There's a pronoun without any referent. Yeah. But so they drop like flakes. So I don't know that before a scholar started to recognize, oh, she did write about the Civil War, that's really what poem is writing about. And it becomes very powerful, I think, to imagine this, for this to be images. That was just the first stanza in the poem, there's another stanza. But to imagine this image of soldiers on a battlefield dropping like flakes. And what's the image of snowflakes that you have? It's, it's vast. Are they slow? Are they fast? Or there's so many of them, and they're, it could be, like a snowstorm, but they're each distinct. Or to drop like stars, they drop like flakes, they drop like stars. That to me seems like a very apocalyptic image of stars dropping out of the sky. Or like, so I guess you get the point that the poems are so abstract. It's easy to not connect them to actual, events that she lived through, because I mean, unless you acknowledge that could be there. But at this point, I think it's probably widely accepted that Dickinson knew about the Civil War and wrote about the Civil War and wrote about other matters that were important in, in the 19th century, the various social struggles, women's lives, abolition, captivity. That there are loads of poems in which those are very overt topics. Again, if you look for them, if if you think that they would be there, they seem obvious if you think they'll be there.
Right.
There's probably more to say about that, but I can see it's already 10 after 8.
Oh, the time does fly. At this point, let me welcome anybody who is in our audience this evening. If you would like to say something, you can either type your name in the chat, or do I dare just speak up? Why don't I do that? Anyone have a question at this moment?
I have a question, if that's okay.
Sure. Who is it? Is that Amanda? Sure, absolutely.
Hi, Professor Runzo.
Hi, Amanda. Nice to see you.
Thanks. Hi, everybody that I haven't seen in a long time. Hello. I have a question for you about when you wrote this book. It sounds like it took a long time. How did your, relationship to Emily Dickinson change over the course of writing the book? It's kind of weird to say about like having a relationship with someone you've never met, but I don't know, at least I feel like that about authors that I study for a long time.
Yeah. No, that's a fantastic question. And probably I'll sort of expand on your question, my relationship to, as you say, to Emily Dickinson, just over like the many decades I've been reading Emily Dickinson, I'm sure has changed quite a bit. I think my understanding of her, maybe that sounds a little too definite. Yeah, I do feel like I understand something about Emily Dickinson. But probably every reader of Dickinson, or every person who studies her and thinks, and really loves her work and appreciates it and feels drawn into it, everybody probably feels that they understand something, even if all those understandings are different from each other. I feel like I had many revelations working on this book. As I mentioned, the one about, wow, I had no idea she had a sheet music collection. I've learned more about, well, I guess there are all kinds of things that I feel like I see her differently. And I guess I've come to a point that this kind of popular image of Dickinson that we have is part factual and part fictional. There's a really, I'm not quite sure why I'm thinking of this particular example, but there's a really interesting book by another great scholar named Deneen Wardrop, who wrote about clothing, Dickinson's clothing, and clothing in the 19th century. And she determines through just tremendous detail and tremendous close study that this image we have of Dickinson, that she's the spinster who always wore white, or she, one of her kind of oddities is that she's the woman, she always wore white. And this was, people thought this was kind of odd, but this is something that was distinctive of her, with her, that she suggested that really wasn't quite true. That she did have white dresses, and the white dress that is extant, that is in existence, that copies were made of that. And there's one at the Dickinson Museum, and I think there's one at the Amherst Historical Society. Those are white, but those, let me work on I think she determined that dress, the white dress that we know of Dickinson, that was made in about 1880 or so. So when Dickinson was about 50. So she's wearing this dress when she's about 50. But anyways, the scholar puts forward a really compelling argument that Emily Dickinson was actually quite a stylish dresser. And we have repressed the fashionable Emily. She does a really close study of the dress in that daguerreotype, the one authenticated image that we have of Dickinson when Dickinson's about 16 years old. And she does a very close study of that. And it's really interesting how this would be considered very stylish dress. And she was actually quite fashionable. And she also, through her research, discovered that actually Emily Dickinson wore clothing in lots of different colors. It wasn't all white, But I guess that's what I mean about the image of the reclusive, isolated, kind of weird, the oddball up in Amherst, who never left her father's house. That image has stuck and still sticks with a lot of people. But it's, for whatever reason, it has staying power. And I think I'm probably indirectly responding to your question, Amanda. I think my own sense of Dickinson only places her more and more in the world and makes her more of a person, I guess, to me. I feel like I see her as a human being, as a person, and not as some abstracted myth. She was called the myth, people, the myth in Amherst, or the enigma, the enigma up in Amherst. I guess she has, I see her as a person.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions?
Yeah, let me try one.
Uh-oh.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see everybody's face, by the way. Hi, everybody. And it's so nice to walk back through your book, Sandy, and
Thanks,
for the
Dave.
chance you've given us to come together and talk about this incredible poet, Emily Dickinson. So I have a really quick epiphany, and then I have a kind of a question. The epiphany has to do with what you're talking about with appearance. I have seen the daguerreotype, and I've seen the other possible photograph of Emily. There are only a couple, and I've seen that family portrait of the three kids. And they're all bloodless. Her hair pulled tight back, and she's sitting there like this. The epiphany I had about Dickinson was just a few years ago when Paige and I went to the Morgan Library and saw this display of Dickinson stuff. There are her handwritten poems. There's her high school yearbook. There's one for you. And there on the wall in a little airtight case was a lock of Emily Dickinson's hair. You probably know where I'm going with this. Emily Dickinson's bright red hair, not that sort of brown washed out stuff in the painting and the photograph. Lucille Ball red hair. And I can imagine that there's something about that spiritedness that the family may have been thinking about when they were disapproving of the daguerreotype. I don't know, but that changed my whole view of Dickinson when I saw that.
That's interesting.
Hair that seems so full of fire, the way her poems are, and not the way the daguerreotype is. So this is leading me to the question here. You were this fascinating observation that we just keep reading her and writing about her in ways that are very rare. And I wonder, I mean, we don't know a lot about her life. We do, we don't, we think we do. But it's really the nature of the poems that leads us to that constant, these 1,800 little bitty poems that are bottomless. That's the thing. When I read her poems, I think there's no bottom to them. And she even writes about that, falling through the earth until and continuing to fall. But they are also so elusive, so evasive, so layered, so unable to be contained in the way that we teachers like to be able to contain a poem and then move on. We can never really get a very good grasp on depth of those poems. I wonder if there's something about that that causes us to continue to imagine her and write about her. Something about the poems themselves.
Yeah, that makes that makes perfect sense to me. They I'm not the only person who's described those poems as riddles. You know, many people refer they are like riddles, they are elusive. And you said 1,800 poems. I understand why you're using that number, but there almost every poem also has many variants.
Right.
So, the poems, if once you look at all, variants of words or of lines, so, they're, what do the poems even, what are the poems? And editors make choices about which are the variants that Emily Dickinson provided, which are the ones that you're going to use. And, the big editions, the multi-volume editions will include all the variants that you can look at. But yeah, it's a sense of all these mysteries, the elusiveness, in some ways that is a lot of the power of them. And it is interesting that they're so elusive. Why do they need to be so elusive? Why do they need to be so much like riddles?
What if that's part of her purpose? In a way that a lot of writers are working towards some kind of capture, some sort of conclusive gathering of wisdom. What if her aesthetic is about the unendingness of things or the unanswerability of things, and in some way maybe anticipating something like modernism or something about the kind of conundrum of the 20th century.
Yeah, that's nice. That makes a lot of sense too. I think this is partly what the power just of poetry is, and I guess of other art forms too, that wonderful poets and Dickinson, it seems like they try to capture something and say something that is so elusive. I guess this is something I just love about poetry too, whether it's feelings or just the vastness of something, or the minuteness of something, or the layers of something. It's just, this seems to be what poetry does. Feelings or ideas or impressions, things that are so hard to understand or to even, you kind of feel like you're just trying to, like, for a minute, just like see it clearly. And a great poet can capture it and kind of bring all the pieces together in, whatever in Dickinson's poem. And you can kind of, even if you feel like you don't completely understand it, you can kind of feel it, at times. So I don't know, I'm not sure if that makes sense. But the elusiveness, it seems to me that one thing, an ongoing concern with Dickinson is how does one see things? How do you see, and what do you see? And it's not sure, it's hard to see clearly. So you have some of those famous poems about, to tell all the truth, but tell it slant. You have to look at things at angles. She has lots of poems that you're looking at things from an odd angle, or you see things in parts, because it seems like it's hard to know what something is, or what it means, or what you're looking at. I feel like I'm becoming just terribly abstract right here about forgive me for that. I don't mean to be so elusive in my own commentary on Dickinson.
I don't think you're being that way at all.
Mhm.
It fits in with everything that you said about the kind of the trickster personality. You talk in the book so beautifully about impersonation,
Yes.
especially in that minstrelsy chapter. So this in order to see all of these kinds of things, to see them slant, to see them small, to see them large, you have to impersonate those points of view.
Mhm.
And once you're in them, you can't leave them behind, just let it all go, because you had to become in order to see. And so you've got all of these lenses, all of these, I mean, that's too cold and callous a word, but you have all of these personalities that are in the poems because they're in the author.
Mhm.
Oh, and the way, I have to say it again, the way that you reveal, you identify, you reveal, and you so patiently and with such selectivity, you articulate these kinds of movements between poems and popular culture. It's just a lovely book
Oh,
for that reason.
thank you, Fred. Appreciate that.
Sorry, didn't mean to kid
No,
it.
no, it was lovely, lovely to hear that. Thank you, thank you.
Other questions? More questions for our author? We have time for one or two more.
I have
Hey, I got. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Andy. Go ahead.
yeah, I have a kind of fan question. Like, a fan always asks this, but like, how did you get interested in Emily Dickinson? I don't know. Is there a story?
That's a good question. I think my introduction to Emily Dickinson was very much like many other school children's, like in the fourth grade, where we had to read poems, and not my cup of tea, really. Although I loved to read and I loved poetry, even as a little 7-year-old, for some reason, I just loved language, or I love poetry. And what, and who was this? Emily, I heard her, so I knew about Emily Dickinson. I knew I was supposed to like her, but it just seemed so corny or something. It just seemed so, the poems they showed us were so boring, and so kind of so sentimental, and so kind of sappy, and they kind of ruined, it was kind of ruined her for me. But
those versions were those versions the edited ones that were made to like?
Oh, I have no idea, but they were the ones about things like bees and honey, and
Okay.
and actually the poem that I've in the process of working on this book, I've really come to love now, but I just thought it was so boring. That poem that starts, "There is no frigate like a book." I just, at the time it was like, oh, books like a boat, you're on a journey, it was so, my own analysis, of course, is very limited, but this is what was presented to me, I thought. But, in the process of doing this work and looking at, these, so many of Dickinson's poems were also written during the Civil War years, but when I learned more about, sort of the Civil War and the naval industry and frigates, and somehow the word frigate just like blew up for me. So suddenly, oh, there is no frigate like a book. It was like, that kind of blows me away now. I was like, oh, there is no warship. This is how I think of it now. There's no warship like a book. So is it a book that you read, or is it a book that you write? And the idea that you're now entering with your book that you're reading or writing, now you're entering dangerous waters. You're entering waters with your book, that are, anything can happen. You may have safe passage, but you may not. That poem now seems really powerful to me. I think to your question, Andy, I think what happened is that at some point, I think maybe I was in college, I decided I was going to read a bunch of Dickinson's poems. So I think I read like hundreds of them. And, as you read more of them, all these poems that I'd never seen before, and they weren't sappy or sentimental, they were scary. And they were, ferocious, and they clearly had really deep feeling. And some of them were about traumas. And, I was in college, so I also felt, like I was dealing with deep
Yes.
feelings and, various traumas and things too. So it's like, wow, it's this thing. She's putting words to feelings that I don't really understand, and I'm trying to grapple with, and she helps me understand things.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I think that hooked me once I read
What are your
more
thoughts?
songs.
Do you think just school kids nowadays still read her like that young?
I would imagine so. I have no idea I can understand why you picked the kind of dull poems. I shouldn't even say that. That sounds different, doesn't it? I can understand that. You don't want to put a poem that a 7-year-old, the starved maelstrom laps the navies, or one one need not be a chamber to be haunted. You don't want to have like necessarily a 7-year-old reading things like that.
God forbid.
I can understand the choice, but it did not help me to appreciate anything really about Emily Dickinson. It was like, oh
yeah,
so boring.
Well, maybe it planted a seed that sprouted.
Maybe so.
Thank you.
We have 1 minute.
I think we've got time for one last question, if anyone's got one.
Sandy, I'd like to ask you a quick one.
Yeah.
How stealthy do you think Emily was being?
How stealthy?
Yes, in her relationship with popular culture. How deliberately stealthy? We might not have Emily Dickinson now if it weren't for the clever, boring poems that got her into the canon in the first place.
Well, that's a very good question. As you know, I'm sure, Mark, that Dickinson, well, she didn't, I don't think she gave her permission to any of the 11 poems that were published when she was alive. She left this to, if they would get published or not, she left this to whoever, friends or relatives. And I don't know that it's a given that they would have necessarily published things. The history of the publication of the poems is very complicated and involves lawsuits, and it's really very dramatic. And again, the rewriting of the poems, and all kinds of battles. And actually, one of the, maybe David or somebody else knows more about this, but one of the strange things is there's like a year and a half in there that, there are poems, and then there's like a year and a half there's nothing. There are no poems and no letters, and then there are like lots of poems again. Things seem to be missing still. And there were very deliberate efforts to, I think, probably make her seem more normal, to censor her poems and to censor her letters. So I guess I see Emily Dickinson as stealthy in various ways. She writes about that. In fact, she writes about, they tried to, that poem that starts, they shut me up in prose as when a little girl, they put me in a closet because they liked me still. And then I'm not gonna be able to quote the whole thing without looking it up, but she compares herself to, you might as well have lodged a bird, put her in a closet. You might as well have tried to put a bird into a pound, to put a bird for treason in the pound. But she, like the bird, only has to will, and as easy as a star, she can abolish her captivity. So I'm paraphrasing. Those are the words. I don't quite have them in the right order, but that's the kind of the idea of the poem, that people wanted to lock her up and to confine her, but she's for treason. Put a bird in a jail for treason. It just it's something so crazy. about that, but she can just, as easy as a star. That is the word phrasing in the poem. As easy as a star. Just abolish her captivity. So, there are lots of poems like that where there are efforts to constrain her or confine her, but she's very clever and tricky. And this might be partly a response to the elusiveness. Why would you be so elusive in her writing? The poems are hard to understand. Sometimes I feel like, after studying a poem, I feel like I really get it and I really love the poem, and I come back to it like a year later, and it's like I don't get it at all anymore. I just don't understand it at all. So that they are tricky. As I said, to me, that Dickinson is a very unorthodox thinker, person. Her imagination is very kind of wild. So she quite likely had much to try to disguise.
That's a lovely note to end on. In fact, please join me in one last round of applause for our author this evening. Whether you're muted or not, the applause will come through.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody.
Please have a good evening. Thank you for spending an hour with us this evening. And tune in next week for the next Monday Musing.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Runzo.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.